The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, or objectivity or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. If you are new to our webinar series or are a regular listener, I'm appealing to you to visit our website and make a donation that will allow us to continue this important programming. Please take notice of the slide on your screen announcing our next New Jersey Walks for TS event being held on April 6th in Mercer County Park in Princeton. I know it's hard to imagine that spring is almost here after the winter we've all experienced. But what better way to enjoy an early spring day than in this lovely park in the heart of Central Jersey. We hope you'll enjoy us for the day. Now I'd like to welcome back Dr. Brian Chu to his third appearance in our Wednesday webinar series. He previously presented on school refusal in April of 2010, and in February 2011 he spoke on selective mutism. Both webinars are archived on our website and available for free download. I'm also delighted to tell you that his previous presentations are two of the most frequently downloaded webinars that we have offered. He's back again tonight to speak on overcoming anxiety and mood problems. Dr. Chu, a New Jersey native, received his undergraduate degree from from the University of Pennsylvania and his Ph.D. from Temple University. He is now Associate Professor and Acting Chair in the Department of Clinical Psychology at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. He is also the Director and Founder of the Youth Anxiety and Depression Clinic, a university-based research clinic that provides evidence-based assessment and treatment for children and adolescents and the dissemination of evidence-based treatment to schools and community clinics. Dr. Chu, welcome. We are delighted to have you back, and without further introduction, I'll turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you, Marty, for having me back, and thank you, Kelly, for setting this up, and for Faith for having me back, and to the NJCTS for allowing me to present on this topic that I find so interesting. We're going to be talking about getting unstuck using behavioral activation and exposure techniques for overcoming mood and anxiety problems. First, I want to just introduce the clinic that I'm the director of. It's called the Youth Anxiety and Depression Clinic. We see any kids between the ages of 8 and 16 for anxiety or mood concerns, providing diagnostic assessments and brief goal-directed behavioral therapies. If you have any questions or looking for more information, you can visit our website or call us at the number below. Also knowing that they will, hold on one second, knowing that many of you may not be in the New Jersey area, I'm also including some resources and website links down at the end of the talk. What I'm going to try to cover today is some background on anxiety and depression, and then introduce the model and theory of behavioral activation, as well as give a description of our a particular program that we've developed here at Rutgers called the Skills Program. And what you should know is that while it's a formal program, it does describe strategies, coping skills that are useful for anyone, whether you're a therapist, a consumer, a parent, a child or adolescent, that you can use in your own daily life. Just to give some background, the kind of problems that we've used this program to address are described here. The formal names are described as disorders, but they also reflect lots of common experiences we have in any given day. Major depression refers to a specific episode of depressed or irritable mood most of the day, nearly every day for 2 weeks, plus a number of other disruptive symptoms that get in the way of a number of domains in one's lives. Dysthymia is simply a term to describe a longer and more persistent course of depression. Separation anxiety, what you see below is a number of anxiety disorders that we use to describe different types of anxiety, and talking about what they focus on. Separation anxiety is talking about fear of being away from home or loved ones, for fear of something happening bad to either yourself or to parents or to loved ones. Social anxiety disorder, worrying about either being embarrassed or evaluated while performing or being around other people. Generalized anxiety disorder, worrying about a number of different things across a number of domains, where the worry is very persistent and difficult to control. And panic disorder, where you have an acute episode of physiological, emotional, psychological experiences that feel catastrophic and feel like something terrible is happening. And while these concerns don't always get the highlight in either schools or in the public news, they are quite prevalent. If you look at community-based studies of the rates of their occurrence in the general public, there's quite a large range, but you see that children over the course of their lifetime, from childhood to adolescence, could experience a significant anxiety or mood disorder, anywhere from like 2% to 3% of youth in their lives. And what we also know is that they're fairly complicated. So even though we often maybe overlook some of these problems compared to some of the more behavioral or conduct problems that attract a lot of our attention, we find that these concerns are very complicated themselves, where a large number of kids who can be diagnosed with a principal problem in anxiety, for example, often have multiple disorders, meaning they can be diagnosed with multiple anxiety problems. About 80% who have one anxiety disorder will also have another. And in fact, kids who are diagnosed with a principal problem in anxiety, about 30% of those kids might also have, meet criteria for a disorder in depression as well. And likewise, if you have a primary diagnosis in depression, about 60% of those kids might have a diagnosis of anxiety as well. And if you look below, it's not even just between these two disorders, but that they often come with what we call co-occurrence or comorbidity with other serious behavioral problems as well. And so what we have done in the field of psychology is develop a number of treatment modalities that are designed to help identify, understand, and then treat these problems. And so one of the more empirically supported treatments for these problems is cognitive behavioral therapy, also abbreviated as CBT. And what that simply refers to is that if we were to look at any kind of emotional experience, for example, depression, we could break that down into three main components: their thoughts, the physical feelings associated with that, and their actions and behaviors. And these are all related, and the more that you understand each of these three components, the more that you can understand where someone is getting stuck when they're feeling depressed. So, for example, if someone has received a bad grade back from their math class, they might have the thought, "Oh gosh, I'm never going to, get any better in math," or "I'm such a failure," to which they might start to have this kind of sinking feeling in their stomach and a little bit of a heartache, to which they might want to go home and crash on their bed. And from so doing, they're thinking, "Oh gosh, I just wasted the whole day, and so I haven't really done much." And that only leads to more sinking feeling in the stomach and then more avoidance and withdrawal. And so what we find is that depression can be explained by this kind of reciprocal spiraling of these different components. However, a different model, perhaps newer, has kind of evolved, called behavioral activation, where they've tried to simplify it, because sometimes it's difficult to have much insight into one's thoughts. And so perhaps we could explain it in a little bit simpler format by just looking at the behaviors and the moods that we find interact with each other. So feeling depressed might just be explained by the kinds of ways that we react to it behaviorally. So when one feels depressed, one might avoid other people, stay inside, withdraw, ruminate about all the bad things that happen during the day. And we might do that because it seems like avoiding one's problems or avoiding the things in life seems like the best option. But unfortunately, that doesn't really change anything, and so it just leads us to continue feeling depressed. Okay? Some of the main theories that inform this approach are probably the original one are Lewinson's kind of pleasant activities model, and a newer functional assessment model developed by Jacobson and colleagues. In Lewinson's model, what they described is that depression is related to a decrease in pleasant events and an increase in adverse events, And so the real therapy model there was to assign large classes of pleasant events as a way to kind of counter depressive mood. And so one might say, over the course of this next week, why don't you go ahead and increase the number of pleasant activities, like the number of times you read a pleasant book or listen to music or go for a walk. And then you could track whether increasing those pleasant activities improves your mood. What Jacobson and colleagues did was they returned to some of the original foundations of behavior therapy to make that process more individual. And what they encouraged was to use an individualized functional assessment to really identify what are the individual triggers that lead to one responding in a depressive way, and what about those responses is leading to that depressive feeling. So how do we do that? How do we do a functional assessment? So just to kind of give a real crash course in functional assessment, we think about it as following an ABC model: antecedent leading to behavior, leading to a consequence. And that's another way of just kind of describing it as saying, when we're trying to explain some sort of depressive response, we're looking at what kind of event triggered what kind of emotional response or behavioral response, and then what happened after that. And so if we were to, another way in kind of real life to kind of describe it is like some sort of life event triggered some sort of behavioral response, inactivity, withdrawal, or inertia, and that itself leads to depressed mood. Okay? And so we're trying to look at, in some situations, why does this maintain itself? One might think that if you had a negative life event, like you got a bad grade, and you withdrew and avoided homework, you would think if that led to depressed mood, that one would stop doing it after a time being. That's actually kind of an unfunctional response. You would think that you would not really get much out of it, and yet it persists. So how can we explain that? Why do we do things that ultimately really don't serve in our best interests? And so we really have to ask ourselves, what function does that behavior, that response, inactivity and withdrawal, really serve us? So let's use an example. So here we're looking at that trigger response and depressed mood kind of sequential chain. Let's use an example of, say, a child who has trouble, getting up in the morning. The alarm clock goes off, and they're wondering whether or not to get out of bed. And I think this is an example that most of us can relate to. The alarm goes off, it's kind of ringing, and you reach over and you just hit the snooze bar. You get about 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever your alarm clock provides, and then the alarm clock goes off again, and you hit it again. And you get another snooze. And it happens maybe a third time, maybe a fourth time. And somewhere in your back of your mind you know, I set the alarm early enough that if I hit it 3 times, maybe if I hit it 4 times, I'm okay. But I know that if I hit that snooze bar the 5th time, I know I'm going to suffer some kind of consequence. I'm going to be late for school, I'm going to be late for work, something's going to happen. And yet, what discriminates those people who are able to get up out of bed at that point, and who are those people who stay in bed? What explains that? Okay. So let's say that you or this kid that we're talking about hits the snooze bar again. What function does that serve? Well, in that moment, what they're trying to do is escape the distress of, one, the kind of annoyance of that buzzer going off, but also possibly some sort of other distress that they're anticipating during the day. Maybe they didn't finish that homework assignment later that's due in math class later in that day. Maybe they didn't have a speech that they're anticipating that they're not feeling very comfortable with. And so by hitting that snooze bar, what they do is they get to avoid either thinking about or having to do something about that distressful event that they're anticipating later today. So why does that, so if we can look at what the function is serving, it's helping avoid, in the moment, having to think about or do something about that distressing event. And you ask yourself, so what effect does that have on one's life? Well, the immediate consequences actually are quite good, right? So in the immediate instance, you actually reduce distress. It serves as a really good way to kind of have a short-term solution to worrying about what's happening later. But unfortunately what happens is that later in the day there are often long-term or secondary consequences, like you'll have to face the fact of poor attendance, a decrease in positive events, an increase in aversive control, meaning the punishments that come because you decide to stay in bed. So in the short term it might have worked for you, but in the long term that's kind of avoidance ends up not working out so well for you. This kind of model is summarized very well in two different formats, one by Addis and Martel and this is a kind of self-help book on the left. On the right, there's a clinician's guide written by Martel, Demizian, and Herman Dunn. These are two resources that I'm not associated with it and don't get any kickbacks on, but just really quality resources that if you want to read further about this approach for adults. And this approach has been shown to have really good support in terms of its efficacy. There have been growing literature supporting this approach, but the original clinical trial that supports it is here was overseen by Sona Demizian in 2006, and all these references are at the end of this talk, comparing behavioral activation with cognitive therapy and antidepressant medication. And what they found was something quite interesting, was that if you compared in the low severity group of depressed adults, all the groups were relatively equal. But if you looked at the high severity group, here measured by the Hamilton Rating Scale, a common interview scale of greater than 20, a score of greater than 20, behavioral activation and antidepressant medications were relatively equal. Their effect sizes, or showing how different these two groups are, were very close to zero, showing quite close to equivalence. The behavioral activation was much better than cognitive therapy, and the antidepressant medication was better than cognitive therapy. And so if we're looking for what to recommend for people who might have severe depression, behavioral activation might be a good way to go if you're not looking to start antidepressant medication. This was also reinforced by a follow-up study where they identified that patients categorized as extreme non-responders did worse in cognitive therapy than behavioral activation. And so if we're looking at what we can recommend, we might think that a simpler form where we have to do a little bit less, not evaluate all of our thoughts, might be beneficial if it's going to give us the same or perhaps better outcomes than, say, cognitive therapy. And so with that, we developed a child and adolescent adaptation of that approach called Group Behavioral Activation Therapy, also called the SKILLS program. And we formalized it in a therapist manual and a workbook. It's not published yet because it's still in development, but we can share it in limited circumstances. But what it does is that it was designed to combine both behavioral activation, which we're seeing very good results for with adult depression, but also powerful exposure techniques, which we're very familiar with in the anxiety literature. And the particular format that we designed this for was to conduct these in group formats in schools. And the reason why we did it in schools was because we find that 75% of youth who ever seek out and receive mental health services do so in the schools. They don't end up coming to outpatient clinics. It's where they feel comfortable, it's where stigma is low, and so they find that that's where they end up getting those services. And so we thought if we wanted to help out the most number of kids, that would be the place that we would go. So we built these group programs for the schools, and yet these same procedures and strategies are very useful whether you're going to do it on an individual basis in outpatient clinics, or even if you were to read it and maybe help your child with some of these strategies as a parent. So what are our skills that we highlight? These are 6 skills that make use of behavioral activation and exposure, and broken down to 6 different steps. The first step is to do a thorough assessment about what you'd like to improve and what you think you're doing well in. So that is, see where I'm stuck. Where are things going okay? Where would I like to improve? The second skill that we teach is keeping active and keep approaching, meaning to highlight the role that avoidance plays in maintaining us in that stuck kind of loop, using active, engaged solutions to take problems head on. In order to help us get there, we want to identify the goals we want to achieve. And so these will be individualized. We'll use an acronym called TRAP that was developed by Martel and colleagues to look at the trigger, response, and avoidance patterns and to see how we get stuck in our traps and that keep us from our goals. We'll then look for ways to accomplish our goals using the acronym TRACK. So once we're find ourselves in a trap, we want to look at how we can get back on track, trigger, response, and alternative choice by using problem solving to weigh the pros and cons of our various options. The fifth skill is lasting change, and that's where we're going to orient people towards making sure that they do a lot of practice in order to try out those solutions that they have highlighted as being potentially useful, rather than just talking about it. And the final skill is to make sure that we're always evaluating those solutions that we have chosen and to see what has worked about them and what has not. So just to highlight some of these skills in a little bit more detail, skill 1 is see where I'm stuck. We use a number of different kinds of skills in order to get to this principle, but the one I'll highlight here is activity tracking. And the purpose of tracking one's activities and their associated mood is to really help kids see the relation between what they do and how they feel. We really help to get them to get more familiar with the activities that prompt different kinds of mood responses, as well as to show that they have quite a bit of control over their mood by virtue of what they choose to do. So here's an example of how we go ahead and get more information. This is a blank activity mood chart, and you'll notice here that it leaves room for each day of the week and important time periods of a child's day. There are a number of different ways you can do it. This is not the only way that you can create an activity mood chart. For many adult versions of this, you'll find each hour differentiated so that you can track your activity every single hour of the day. What we find is that for kids, time is grouped into pretty major chunks of their lives. The morning time, including getting ready for school and the morning classes, lunchtime, afternoon, after school, and evening times. And what we want them to do is, when we ask them to complete this, is to describe what are the events or what are their activities that were occurring during each period of time, and then to provide their own rating of how they felt, from 0, that's the worst mood I've ever felt, to 10, the best I've ever felt. And we hope to help find out a lot of information about them and also share our insights about their patterns of behavior by using this. Here's an example of a completed activity mood tracker. This is just a fictional compilation for a girl, Jasmine. And the way that I would go through using this activity mood tracker is to review it a couple of different ways. First, I would go and look at all the low ratings that reflect a low mood. So you have the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and I would try to see what kinds of events or activities are associated with those moods. So here I would see Jasmine got up late, skipped breakfast, ran to the bus, led to a mood of 3. Got up late, mom made me take out trash, missed the bus, 2. Okay, so already I'm getting the idea that, well, getting up late or running to the bus might be activities that tend to be associated with low mood for Jasmine. Then I also look for some other activities like, oh, Kelly was out, sat by myself. Well, maybe she's also very sensitive to when she has to be alone or when she's feeling lonely. Similarly, we have the math teacher yelling at me, not listening. So maybe when she's feeling criticized or feeling like she's not very competent, that would also lead to a low mood. So I look for just single events or activities that tend to be associated with low mood. And then I would also look for activities that are associated with higher mood. So 7, went to choir. It's a nice release, little homework. That led to a bigger mood. 10, called my friends. I got a solo in choir. Right? So it seems like when she's feeling confident or she's feeling like she's achieved something and she's spending time with friends, she is having higher mood. So you can look at really just isolate events like that. But then I also like to look for trends. So the way I look for trends is I will go across the days within a time period and see if there are any common themes. So as we already started pointing out, when Jasmine gets up late, skips breakfast, runs to the bus, it seems to lead to a lower mood. So here again, all the 2s and 3s are where she's getting up late. The one time where she's feeling a little bit more moderate, she got up, got ready, ate breakfast. Got up, got ready, ate breakfast. Now, of course, this is a compilation, but it's not uncommon to find themes like this that weren't very evident to you before you wrote it down. So it's important to kind of make sure that you write it down, because thinking about it retrospectively, you lose a lot of detail. Same way, I will go within a day down the timeline to see in the course of a day what leads to changes in mood. So getting up late, skipping breakfast, ran to bus, and 3. Sat with Kelly and Shalonda. It's too short, but it's fun. So again, social activities improved her mood. Then she went to math class, where she didn't really like it, but had fun at science. That was a 4. Then I'm sorry, I don't know why that changed. Okay. Then she went to choir. It was a nice release. Mom worked late. Sister friends felt lonely. So what we see here again is that by virtue of the different events and activities, her mood changes over the course of the day. But what you can start using this to show is that, in fact, you have control over some of these things, meaning that if you know reliably that going to choir helps your mood improve, then maybe when you're feeling down, maybe you can do things like that activity, calling up your friends, starting to sing, getting that group together. Maybe if you know that feeling lonely is a sensitive trigger to you, you would be able to call friends, interact with people, hanging out with your sister more. So this is a way to use a simple task that's really just recording what already happens to give you information about how you could possibly change your behavior. Here are just some more descriptions about some of the themes that we just talked about and how you can use that mood activity tracker. Skill 2 is keep active and keep approaching. So once we've started to learn about ourselves, we're going to then want to get active. And before we do a lot of individual functional assessment, it's sometimes important to just know that getting physically active can be very useful. So if you can imagine having a bad day, the difference between, say, going home, you had a bad day in math, you got a C on a test, you assigned all this homework, you don't really know how to do it, and you just go back to your bed and you crash, and you lay there in bed. While that might feel relieving at first, over time it feels like you're just kind of sitting there unmoving, unproductive, and you might start feel and ruminate like things aren't getting better. Compare that to even the simple possibility of going for a walk instead. And we'll come back and talk about all the different benefits of going for that walk instead of going and crashing in your bed. But one of the immediate things is that it simply gets you active and prevents you from doing all the negative things like going back to your bedroom and crashing. And so what we want to do is encourage our kids, when you're feeling bad, identify some things that you can do that are always there, reliable, easy, and fun that could snap you out as a quick intervention. So identify things that don't depend on other people because you're not always going to have others around, and identify things that you also like to do with other people because we don't want you to isolate fully. After that message, we go into skill 3 where we do want them to identify goals I want to achieve, and we'll use a couple of different techniques like the distress loop and the distress spiral. I'll focus on the individual functional assessment tool where we use the TRAP acronym. And when we refer to the TRAP acronym, what this is doing is basically teaching the individual, child or adult, how to identify the triggers, responses, and avoidance patterns that seem to get them stuck. And when we refer to triggers, we're thinking about people, places, events, or even internal feelings like noticing that you're feeling upset or anxious. That can serve as its own trigger. And then we're going to ask them to identify what are the emotional responses you have to those triggers, sadness, anger, or fear. And what we're going to target them in on is looking at those avoidance patterns that keep them stuck, as we described in that original distress loop. That once they get stuck into that pattern, it's hard to get out. So looking at the anxious patterns, how we avoid, how we escape our problems, ignoring the situation, worrying. Depressive patterns like procrastination, isolation, withdrawal, negativity that keep us from proactively addressing the problem. And what we found working with our kids in the middle schools here in kind of mixed suburban and urban communities is that a lot of our kids express their mood and anxiety problems with anger. They often find themselves irritable, snappy, lashing out. And all of these, although you don't see them as avoidance, can really be seen as avoidance patterns in the sense that they help the kid to take the easy way out. So instead of addressing the problem head on, acting quickly, having snap judgments, pushing their way out of the problem, helps them not have to face the actual problem there. And so we've adapted the TRAP to also refer to anger patterns. So here's a graphic example of how we might use the TRAP. So if a trigger is a kid getting teased by other kids at school, their emotional response might be to feel sad, feel alone. And then their avoidance pattern would be keeping to myself, not telling anyone, tell myself I'm a loser, right? So when you feel sad, if you choose to avoid the problem, that leads to kind of continuing to make the problem worse, because the more that you keep to yourself, the more that you don't tell anyone, the more that you kind of criticize yourself, the more you feel sad or alone. Same with an angry example to help translate. If you're sitting there and your sister is talking loudly while you watch TV, that might evoke an angry or annoyed emotional response. And in that moment, if you choose the quickest, easiest solution, you might yell at her to be quiet, you might hit her, you might sit and stew. But that rarely solves the problem of your sister talking loudly while you're watching TV. Instead, it usually makes the problem worse. It either continues to make you angry or annoyed. It might start a fight with your sister. You might get in trouble with your parent. And so that only maintains you feeling angry and annoyed, which then would make you want to do choose another quick solution, like, well, yelling back. And that only continues to make the problem worse when you continue to be angry. Okay. This is an open-ended kind of stuck loop where we can help them really individualize it to whatever might trigger what kind of individual feelings that they're experiencing. And for kids to evaluate for themselves, how are they responding? And is that an avoidance or an angry kind of response? And then later, did that make the problem better or worse? Okay. Once we've gotten them a little bit more in touch with what their traps are, we then try to orient the kids to thinking about how they can get back on track. Here, the first two steps are the same, trigger, response, but then we want to orient them towards alternative coping. And that's a fancy word for kids, and so we've also translated that to be adaptive coping, or for us, really active coping or active choices. And what we mean by that is that we want them to choose something that breaks free of avoidance, so active rather than anxious or depressive responding, approaching their problems with active problem solving, and asking for help when you need it really helps them at least prevent themselves from getting stuck in the trap and helping them get back into a direction where they can actually make their lives better. So here's a graphic of how we explain the track steps. So in that same example where the child is getting teased by kids at school, you might feel sad or alone. And when you're faced with that same choice about whether to withdraw, to stay by yourself, to isolate, if you instead chose a more active approach, like talking to a friend about it, telling a teacher, or standing up to them, what we would hypothesize is that would lead to some kind of new outcome. Now, I'm very careful to mention two things. First, teasing and bullying has become a very important issue in our schools, and it's a very serious systemic issue and not just an individual issue. So most schools have developed some sort of systemic response to it. And so this is really focused on the individual, and it's very compatible. We also have a bullying program that's based off of this. And this is meant to be compatible with whatever kind of school-based intervention is also being conducted. But what this highlights is that, so that's one, it's very compatible. Second, being active and being proactive does not necessarily mean that it's going to change necessarily the original trigger in the way that you necessarily want. So getting teased by kids in school, you're feeling sad and alone. Let's say we brainstorm and you decide, I'm going to talk to a friend or tell a teacher. Let's say you tell the teacher, that may or may not actually get the other kids to stop teasing you at school. We may not have much control over that. But by simply telling a teacher, it changes the trap that you were in. It might make you feel like at least you have one ally, so that even if the teacher couldn't stop the kids from teasing, at least you know you have one person to go to. At least you have some buffer when you're in that classroom. Maybe it's just the fact that you felt understood. Same with telling a friend. The friend might not be able to protect you from those kids teasing you, but at the same time, maybe it gives you someone to feel like you have some sort of social support. So the goal isn't always to change the actual original trigger, even though it sometimes can. By changing the sequence, you often do, but it also can have other subtle outcomes that are very beneficial, like growing your confidence, growing your social support buffer, having a sense of efficacy in how you deal with problems. And so I just want to be mindful that we think very broadly about the outcomes we find important. This is another example of using the angry loop, right? So getting into a fight with a friend, feeling angry, hurt, and betrayed. Now one could simply take the quickest choice by snapping back at them, yelling at them in the hallway, starting a rumor about your friend. All those things might serve to immediately alleviate your immediate anger and hurt, but that doesn't usually resolve the problem. Rather, it just prolongs the fight with your friend, and it makes you probably feel a little bit bad for having to resort to those sorts of tactics. So instead, we recommend two things. First, we do recommend stepping away. I think most of the people, when they're thinking about dealing with impulsivity or kids getting angry, kids having conflict problems, most people say, I don't think avoidance is a problem at all. I wish these kids would avoid more. One kid says something bad, another kid says it in return, and then they start fighting. So I don't see avoidance as a big problem. And we would agree with you there that in the moment, avoidance is not really the problem. In fact, we would encourage, if there is a chance that anger can elevate into aggression, we would encourage kids to step away, take a time out. And you see that in our 2 steps there. First, step away. But what happens is that usually when kids react angrily, they'll have some sort of quick, short burst of anger. They'll yell, make fun, get into a fight. But then they secondarily avoid. They escape. They avoid that kid in the future. They never attempt to resolve the initial conflict. Not all conflicts are resolvable, but many are. So particularly if you're getting into a fight with a friend, once you've gotten angry, it's harder to go back and resolve those issues, and it gets increasingly harder with time. So what we recommend is first stepping away, but then doing something proactive to try to resolve that problem, talking to your friend, resolving the misunderstanding, etc. And again, it may or may not fix the actual relationship with the friend, but it can have a lot of important secondary consequences, like maybe you find that you get support from another friend when you're brainstorming ideas. Maybe it makes you feel like at least you were able to express yourself and feel like you got heard even though they don't agree with you. So again, using track to get out of your trap has a lot of nuanced potential benefits. But we also believe that no matter how much you talk about a problem or plan for it, we think that practice is the most important way to really address getting into consistent traps. So we start to introduce what we call exposures, and these are kind of clinical terms for really practice exercises. We also use the term in vivo, which means in real life exposures or in real life practice. And this is what distinguishes the skills group a little bit from maybe some of the adult versions of behavioral activation, in which a lot of their therapy recommendations are oriented towards homework assignments. We like to actually build practice experiences in the group, and you can do this in individual therapy too, but in the session so that you can actually push the child to practice the tracks that they have identified, and then also help them by watching them identify what kind of traps they get into in the moments. Okay? So here's a way of describing the kind of background or philosophy of an exposure that's very compatible with behavioral activation as well. This is what we call the habituation curve. Other people call it the worry curve, the fear curve. And what it's meant to describe is that you have 2 axes here. One is like stress level, and here the horizontal axis is just time. And what we know about distress is that in response to a trigger, say for example, getting a bad grade in math, or maybe going to a party where you're feeling really like alone or you don't know anyone. When you get confronted with that trigger, distress is necessarily going to go up. We're built to respond to scary situations with increased distress. That's a natural response. Okay, but we do know also that the body is meant to kind of naturally balance itself off, to habituate over time, because it can't sustain constant distress all the time. So if you were going to, say, a party where you didn't know anyone, and if you just stuck it out, you would find that your anxiety and your stress would get better over time and it would come down. And so just like this, we would also recommend that in practice, when we're doing in vivo exposures, what we're trying to do is get kids to confront situations that are difficult for them, to experience that initial increase in distress, but then to realize that with time they can get better and it can feel more under their control. So what's an example here? This is an example of, say, school refusal again, where what we would expect is that a child who's having trouble getting to school, when that alarm goes off or when mom or dad comes into the bedroom and says it's time to go to school, we have an increase of distress. And that distress tends to build and build and build as they get ready for school, they go down for breakfast, they get into the bathroom to get ready, they get dressed, they get into the car, they're going to school, and it keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And what we try to remind our families about is that if they just kept going and getting over to school, get to the first class, get to the second class, that eventually they would get over that hump and things would get better over time. The problem with anxiety, and we can make the extension to mood problems as well, is that oftentimes when people are feeling distressed, what they do is they escape. So if this kid is getting ready in the bathroom, then getting dressed, then getting into breakfast, and he says, forget this, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm going back to bed, and he goes back to bed, what happens to his distress level? Well, at that moment, boom, distress drops. He's solved the problem. He's back in bed, you feel better. And this comes back to our original example of short-term versus long-term consequences. If you were to avoid or escape stressful situations, it would feel better in the short term, and so it reinforces you're doing that. You know, oh, the next time I'm feeling really distressed, I just have to escape the situation and I'll feel a lot better. It actually works. It's a logical formula to kind of to come to. It's a logical conclusion to come to. Unfortunately, what happens is that you never get to learn the rest of this curve, which is that if you had just stuck it out, if you had gotten into the car, if you had gotten to school, things would have gotten better. And so the more that we tend to escape, the less that you're able to learn that things get better. And so that's why we really promote behavioral practice, so that they can learn for themselves that if I approach this difficult situation, things will get better. It's something that we really can't talk them into, and it's not even something, or it's hard to assign them to do for practice at home without giving them some real-life experiences in our treatment clinics. So these are some of the goals and values of practicing exposures. The model I just showed you was based mostly off of habituation, such that things get better over time. But there are plenty of situations where sometimes things don't feel better, right? So let's say that you're in that birthday party you went to where you don't know anyone, and no one talks to you the whole time. You might still feel pretty stressed out the entire time you're at that birthday party, but maybe you still made it through, and maybe you've learned that you can tolerate that distress. You don't fall apart. It's not the worst thing ever, and that's an important lesson to learn too. It also gives you an opportunity to practice skills. So actually learning how to create a conversation, say in that party example, asking people questions about themselves, being reciprocal, telling them things about yourself, which can increase your own self-efficacy as well. These behavioral practices can also be an opportunity to give very clear, direct, positive, and constructive feedback, saying, by the way, you didn't look nervous when you were having that conversation with that friend, but at the same time I noticed that he was asking a lot of questions of you, but you didn't ask any question, or you didn't say much about yourself. You would always turn it around and ask questions back, so maybe you want to tell more about yourself. One of the important things that we like to remind the kids that is a real positive outcome of behavioral practice is the pleasant surprise. So I've heard the phrase said that 99% of life is just showing up, and I think that's embodied into this treatment approach. And I think it bears out with our experience that it's impossible to really appreciate what value there is out of life if you're sitting there at home on your bed, crashed out because you had a miserable day. Even no matter how miserable your day is, going home and crashing on your bed doesn't help you change your mind that life can be miserable. And so what we try to argue for is that simply getting up and getting out can lead to some better things. And maybe not for the reasons that we thought. So earlier when I said sometimes it's important to just like get up, get out of bed, go for a walk around the block. Okay, maybe that seems like a real kind of trivial response to feeling depressed. What does going for a walk around the block do for you? Well, we do know that actual physical activation can't hurt, and in fact sometimes it does make you feel a little bit better. But really what it does is it makes you open to a number of possibilities that you couldn't have anticipated. Maybe when you're walking around the block, maybe you see a new kid that you didn't realize lived a couple houses down the street. Maybe that kid has a dog, and maybe like he's like playing with the dog, and you start joining in and have a good time. Maybe you realize you have a lot more common interests about dogs or about something else at school, and you made a friend. You would not have gone out for a walk around the block thinking you were going to make a friend, but simply getting out there puts you in position to possibly make a friend, even when you weren't expecting it. So that's what we call the pleasant surprise. And it requires a lot of active work on the part of a therapist, a counselor, or a parent who's helping the kid do these practice exercises to help notice these surprises, because kids who are depressed or anxious are so trained to only look at the negative that they don't always notice all the good stuff going around them, and so it's important to highlight that for them. Hey, did you notice how you met that kid and you had a great conversation even though you weren't expecting it? Same with our example of being at that party where you didn't know anyone. Maybe you sat there and because your parents said that they would pay you 20 bucks if you just stayed the whole time at this party, you stuck it out, you learned that you could tolerate distress, and that's great, but is that really the kind of life that you want to live? Well, maybe at the very last minute, some kid comes over and says, hey, I didn't know that you were here. And you start a conversation there. Maybe it was short-lived, but maybe it gave you an opportunity to maybe exchange phone numbers. It's that pleasant surprise that you just don't know when it's going to happen. And if you escape early on in the party, you might never have been there. And so we like to remind them that that's part of the purpose of the exposures, to be open to life's experiences. In the end, we also remind them that in the worst case scenario, let's say everything goes wrong, it also teaches us that you could probably survive most bad experiences even when things go all the wrong ways that you don't hope that they would go. So how do we set up these behavioral practices? This is a worksheet that we use that's consistent with the strategies and principles that we laid out earlier. And so it's oriented to have them both identify their traps, identify some new tracks, and then to put it into practice. So for example, this one starts with the trigger, response, your traps on your left side, your tracks for each one on the right side, and then talking about how they can put it into practice and then notice the results. Here's an example of a completed worksheet. Here the trigger is a kid worrying that calling this kid at school who I want to hang out with is making him nervous, afraid, and down on himself. So the response is anxiety and pretty intense at an 8 out of 10. We'd have them complete what they think are their traps on the left-hand side. Well, usually I guess what I would do is put off the call, wait until the last minute to maybe call him, because then I'll have plans and then I'll be safe, right? I can have an excuse for why he says no. Another trap I might get into is getting down on myself, thinking he wouldn't want to hang out anyway. A third trap might be just talk to him at school, hope he asks to hang out, so not really being proactive about that. And instead we have them brainstorm different possibilities about what he can do instead of those traps, like instead of putting off the call, text him right away. That way, or text him instead of calling, that would be maybe less scary. Then instead of getting down on myself, don't worry about this one kid, join a group where I can meet lots of people. Then instead of just talking to him at school, hope he asks to hang out, talk to him at school, focus on the common interests, then push myself to ask him to hang out. Okay? In this case, this character kind of chose number C, or letter C, talk to him at school, focusing on a common interest. So that's the track that he's going to put into play after weighing the pros and cons. I didn't write those out, but you would go through pros and cons for each track and then choosing one. Once you've done that, this should probably be above number 6. You identify some achievable behavioral goals in order to get to these tracks, talking to the kid at school, talking about their interest in basketball, telling them where there's a pickup game after school, right? So then that would be the things that you'd be looking to push yourself to do. The results you'd want to evaluate, how did it go? It went good. He said he couldn't do anything today, but we talked a lot about basketball. We thought maybe another day would be okay. So again, here's something, an unanticipated event or outcome of doing this. You wanted to hang out, but instead you got to learn that you had a different common interest. The distress rating might have been afterwards is a 5, which is lower than the 8. And it might have been difficult, but at least it was helpful. The take-home message being, I was thinking way too much about it. Sometimes you just have to do it. Okay? Then we would try to put it into practice. So here's an example of some what we call how to build an exposure or exposure hierarchy or a list of exposures. This is another kid made-up name and a compilation of different kind of characteristics of various kids that we work with. Scott, 14-year-old boy with major depression, school refusal, oppositional behavior, significant anhedonia, which is just seeming refers to having less interest in doing things that you used to do for the last 6 months, stopping going to Boy Scouts, playing in the band, seeing friends, real significant social isolation, and converting all of this social activity to online video games. So how would we build a series of exposures to help address Scott's depression and potential school refusal? Well, here we would come up with a list from 1 to 10, easiest to hardest, of activities that would help push him to get to that habituation curve, challenging him to identify his traps and then identify some tracks and getting over that hump. So maybe starting with texting friends that he knows. That might be challenging because he's already become comfortable with going home and being by himself. And so even just texting people requires some sort of effort. And so feeling you have to put effort into texting them is difficult at first, but then if you get over the hump, you realize, oh, it's not so big deal, and then maybe they say some funny things, and then it's not so bad. The next step would be texting new friends, which adds on a little bit of anxiety because you're reaching out and you're setting yourself up for rejection or disappointment. Calling kids that he plays online with, hanging out with a scout friend outside of Scouts, going to a Scouts meeting. And so you see that as we go, the practices get harder and harder, building on their prior successes, always really evaluating how did these tracks work for your particular traps. Okay? And we would do all of these in session with our kids, and so this is something that you could do either individually in a counseling session at school, in a group, in an outpatient clinic, and also with as a parent with your child as well, finding ways that you could practice together, identifying traps that he gets into and tracks that would help disrupt that pattern. Okay. Once we've done practice, we return to seeing what worked, revisiting those individual goals, and even completing another activity mood tracker to see how those patterns have changed. Just to give you a quick indication that we have evaluated this in a small randomized clinical trial and the outcomes have been positive at this point, we piloted this in a group of 7th graders in a large middle school, screening close to 900 kids, doing in-home diagnostic interviewing with about 74, and then randomly assigning 35 children who met diagnostic criteria for an anxiety or mood problem to either treatment or wait list in a 2-to-1 ratio. The non-clinical kids was used for a different part of the study, but in terms of our treatment efficacy, we're comparing these 35 kids, which is a small sample, but just looking to see if we could detect early effects at both pre-treatment, post-treatment, and a 3-month follow-up. And what we found was some initial good reasons for encouragement. So if we were looking at the child's principal diagnosis, meaning the most important or most severe diagnosis, what we found was that the rates of remission, or having their principal diagnosis going from present at pretreatment to absent at post-treatment, to be rather positive, having 57% of kids showing some kind of remission, as opposed to 43% who did not. But also looking at comparing to the wait list who received no treatment, 29% of those kids after 15 weeks did not have any remission versus 71%. This was not a significant difference, mostly because of the sample size, but it was trending in the right direction. What was significant was looking at their secondary diagnosis. And so if we revisit the fact that these kids often have a number of co-occurring complex disorders, what we found is that the kids who received GBAT did show quite a significant difference in terms of their rates of remission compared to waitlist. 71% of kids after 15 weeks of GBAT showed a remission versus 10% of those in the waitlist. If you're interested in these approaches and other examples of it, this is a book that my colleague Jill Ehrenreich-May and myself just published through Guilford. It's an edited textbook, and so it gives a number of chapters about the theory, basic research about taking this approach to children and adolescents, as well as some examples of treatments that have good empirical support. I mentioned earlier that there's a number of resources out there for parents, consumers, as well as clinicians and researchers, and these are the ones that I think have some of the most useful practical information. The American Psychological Association Society for Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology has both a therapist finder as well as a number of keynote talks, as well as workshops that one can go and log on to, many of which are free, so that you can find more information about the kind of problems that affect your child and what the experts would recommend that you do. The same with the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy, that is more adult-oriented, and so that you can find some of the same kind of resources there for adult-oriented problems. And the same with the American Psychological Association Division of Clinical Psychology. I just wanted to give acknowledgement to the Clinician Third Generation Foundation for their funding, as well as to the school personnel, graduate students, interviewers, and therapists who have helped with the research and ideas that have contributed to this topic and talk, as well as to provide some references for your further reading. And so I appreciate your attention and participation, and welcome any questions at this point.
Well, I think we have a number of them. Thank you very much. I think it's a lot of great information for parents to consider. We're running long on time here, so I'm going to start right with some questions. So if my child doesn't want to get out of bed, where would you start with a child like that?
Yeah, I would break that whole process down to as small of a units as possible. I think people want to strive towards large, meaningful goals because we think that that's going to be the thing that motivates us. But it's actually the opposite, in that you just really need to find some success in the small steps first. So I would start by, instead of having an alarm clock right next to the child, it depends on what age they are, but say that they're already at the stage where they can be waking themselves up, I would put the alarm clock, instead of within their reach, just out of their reach, right? So put it on the floor next to the bed, so that at least they have to reach over the edge of the bed and hit the snooze button before they can stop the alarm. Then once they've done that for a day or two, move it just outside of their reach, so that they actually have to kind of crawl out of, reach further out of bed. Then I move further so that they have to get out of bed in order to hit the alarm clock to hit snooze. So then, even if the most that that child can do is get up out of bed, hit that snooze button, and then curl back up onto the floor and lay there on the floor, at least you're not in bed anymore. And I would take those little steps as successes and indications that they're moving, rather than just looking at that as failure and hopelessness. And so what I would do is start with the smallest things possible, and just start working them out so that they can take step by step by step.
Okay. That's easier said than done, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we also have to remember that oftentimes if we've gotten to the point where a child or adult is in bed and they can't get themselves out of bed, it didn't happen overnight either. And so we often have this kind of paradox where we've witnessed a problem develop over years, but we expect the cure to happen over a matter of days or weeks. And so I think that's a little bit of an unfair expectation. And so part of what we have to do is realize that successes come in possibly as small increments as they became problems in.
Okay, fair enough. One mom writes that her child sleeps through 7 alarms that are set across the room. Now what is her question?
Well, at some point, what I would do is, I would make sure that you have had a chance to help them get up. And so rather than, some kids might need some additional supports, and so make sure that you're involved in that. And so if the child's sleeping through alarms, make sure that you are going in and helping to prop the child up and to see whether or not they can respond to that. At some level, then to make sure that it's something that they're at least waking up to and that they just can't motivate after that, you can take one of two directions. We would really recommend taking the direction of incentives first. And what we've done is that we want to find whatever incentive it takes to just get them out of bed. So again, in addition to just making it difficult for them to sleep through it, moving it further away, we also try to find things that would make it actually incentivizing, like, if you get up, you can turn on the TV here, or if they have, if they really like to text with their friends, have the phone just out of reach and have it across the room, that as soon as you get up, go and text your friend, or have their favorite breakfast right across the room. Do something and engage your child to kind of brainstorm what are the things that might give you incentive to just get up out of bed in those moments. And what we'll find is that, oftentimes they can't see, past the very moment, and so you have to make the rewards very present right there. They can't think of the benefits. Oh, if I get up out of my bed now, I'll have a good time in first period, social studies. You really just have to highlight what would it take to get you up out of bed right now, and what would make it rewarding for you.
Okay, well, we'll try. How does this work with old in particular who's suffering from depression triggered by some school anxiety?
Now, I'm sorry, you were cutting out a bit, so I couldn't hear the beginning part of the
Okay, how would this work with an older teen who is suffering from depression triggered by school anxiety?
Right. I think that we would use the same approach, and all of these examples sound like they're coming, would be related to school refusal or school anxiety, and that getting up in the morning is something that's common amongst our kids. In fact, it's the one of the primary referral reasons they come to our clinic. And what we use is kind of the same approach, which is that we assume that if we take a step back, getting to school is better than staying at home, so that no matter what, no matter how stressful school is and no matter how anxiety-provoking it is, really it's better to be there than to be at home, because you don't get anything new from being at home. So in general, what we're trying to do is show that avoidance doesn't help, because you're not going to get any better by staying in bed. But then we would use many of the same techniques I just described to try to get them out of bed. I don't think that the reason, whether it initially started because of school anxiety, or whether it started because they were doing poorly in school, or because their friends rejected them, or because they had, say, a death in the family, makes a big difference. Someone could end up not wanting to get out of bed because they're feeling depressed for any of those reasons, and we would take somewhat of the same approach.
Okay, thank you. Can we talk about trap a little bit? You mentioned that a trap can start from anger, but if this particular kid gets into fights at school a lot, the last thing the mom wants him to do is engage the problem more. So how do can you explain that a little bit? Clarify that?
That's a great question, and I will confess that wasn't an adaptation that we did intentionally beforehand. So we were piloting this group in the schools, and we found that these kids who we've recruited or are included in the group because they were anxious or depressed were really expressing a lot of anger, and that the way that they were expressing their upsetness was getting into fights at school, having a lot of interpersonal conflict. And so we tried to ask them, well, do you think that this idea of avoidance could fit for you at all? And they still said yes. And the reason is this, is for what I described earlier, is that after that initial moment, which we would call aggression, they were getting into fights, there are a number of ways that you can resolve that that original conflict to never get approached, because after that moment, you end up avoiding that person. So yes, we would say in the moment when you think you're going to get into a physical conflict, we would encourage you to remove yourself, prevent yourself from getting into a fight, separate, go another way. But then after that time has cooled down, what we would say is think about some other ways that you can resolve the situation that initially led to that argument in the first place. If it was a friend, some proactive communication and talking with that friend might be helpful. Even if it wasn't, if there was a fight amongst people who don't like each other, then try to figure out some way that you can mediate that solution, that conflict, when cooler heads have prevailed. Now, that may or may not be going up to that kid and having a direct conversation. It could be approaching a teacher, approaching a coach, approaching another adult in order to help mediate that solution. But oftentimes those choices aren't made because you're so worried that, oh, well, I don't want to appear weak, or I don't want to give in any, or I don't want to admit any wrongdoing. And so because we're angry, we avoid any possible solutions, even when those solutions might end up making the situation better for you overall.
Okay. I have a question about the mood chart. Is that a tool that could be successfully used by a parent and a child, or would you need to be more in a clinical setting? But if it is for a parent and child to use, is there any advice you want to give on how to approach that? How's the best way to
Sure. I think the activity, the activity mood tracker, I think, has pretty broad applications, and I think it can be used as a self-help tool for an adult or teenager, and it can be used with younger teens or kids with help from their parents. And the way that I would introduce it would be to approach your child and just say, look, I noticed that your behavior has been changing. I noticed that you're feeling sadder and more moody, and when you are like that, I see that you're isolating yourself away, and I'm worried about that. And so I'm wondering if we can just use this tool that I came across to help us understand, what gets in your way, or when you find yourself stuck in these traps, just to figure out what are the things that trigger your down moods. And you can each fill out a different version, so you can each have a blank copy, and you can say to your kid, hey, why don't you fill this out over the week, and I'll do the same and see if I notice, and then we'll compare notes. And then both the child and the parent gets together later and say, what did you notice on Monday? What about in the morning? What about the afternoon? What about the evening? And go through each day and try to piece together some of the patterns that I described earlier, which is to look for trends in terms of events that trigger down moods, look for activities that improve moods, and which are the kind of activities that the child has control over.
So you're saying that a parent would do it as well as the kid then?
Absolutely. I mean, when we are working with a family, we find that each, the parent and the child has different perspectives. They see different things, and so we find it valuable to get the perspective of the people who have the most interactions with the child. And that could be someone even not the parent. It could be a teacher. It could be an important coach or someone else.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. You talk about using incentives to get someone active. So do you only use incentives, or does punishment ever factor into that?
Yeah, we try to focus on the incentives rather than punishments. What we find is that particularly for kids who are experiencing depression, they're already discouraged, and so adding on punishments doesn't necessarily motivate them to try something new. And so we do, after we've identified their traps and their trends, we come up with goals that look like that list of exposure hierarchies and say, here's what we're going to be working towards. We're going to try to have you do each of these new things. And we recognize that that's going to be hard. That's going to take a lot of work. So what kinds of rewards or incentives would be meaningful to you when you're accomplishing these things? Now, and then you can either give a reward after each one of those successes, or you can accumulate points. And what I'm always quick to remind both kids themselves as well as adults, it certainly doesn't have to be money or monetary in terms of the rewards. Most of the time, the best rewards are those things that are intrinsically rewarding. And for younger kids, that could mean simple privileges like getting your favorite meal cooked, or spending time with mom or dad, or getting the privilege of controlling the TV show for family TV night. For older teens, it could be getting to invite your friends over on Friday night, or being able to go somewhere with meet up with your friends at the mall or something like that. And certainly, you can always use things like access to their cell phone or to other desirables that are important to them. The times that we use consequences are really in those instances where the child is not performing the key functional expectations like going to school. And so I guess a short way to do that, I'll refer you back to my school refusal webinar, in which we more in detail outline what are the kind of rewards and contingencies that you can use. But it's not that we're doing punishment so much as that there are natural contingencies that ought to be put in place so that you're encouraging desired behavior, but at least not rewarding the undesirable behavior.
All right. Just to follow up to that, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
So do you have an opinion about, I mean, today kids, I think there's an expectation that they get the TV in their room, or they get the cell phone, or they just automatically acquire these things. What about the idea of kind of starting with a blank slate so that kids do not automatically get? They have to earn, and I don't mean pay for, but I mean they have to earn by good behavior the cell phone or the tablet or the whatever, so that you work it in reverse. Instead of giving everything up front and then taking it away as a punishment, you reserve those things and they're earned rather than just given freely. Or am I too old to consider
absolutely.
that might be an option?
No, Marty, you've landed on one of the pieces of psychoeducation that is usually the most central of what we describe. And I want to hesitate or just pause for a second in making sure we're distinguishing. The kids that I was kind of talking about today are anxious and depressed. They're not necessarily oppositional, and so there's a slight difference in how we approach it. But so for kids who are actively, say, school refusing, and I discussed this in that other webinar, that for sure you can have a pretty frank discussion with your child to say, that. And what I'll tell parents that, I have no problems with providing all these lovely privileges to our kids, and we all do that freely, but that's also with the expectation that they're living up to their end of the bargain. And we have to also remind ourselves that there's a difference between like kind of rights and privileges with our kids, that kids have some very few basic rights, which is housing, clothes, food, and love. And all the other stuff are kind of privileges. And that's okay that we give them freely when everything's going well. I give you a cell phone because I want you to feel, because you want a cell phone. But if they were to do something like not go to school anymore, or let's just start there. If they're not going to school anymore, then the deal has kind of changed. And so then the contract can be rewritten, in which is saying, look, one of the main responsibilities for every kid is to go to school, and so as long as you're not going to school, then I have to make these privileges things that you have to earn rather than just getting them automatically. And so when everything's going well, I guess it's not something that you really have to think much about, except when things have changed, you're allowed to change the deal as well. For, if you're looking for kids who are not necessarily doing oppositional behavior, you could, provide a similar kind of statement, but I don't know that you have to be so, doctrinaire about that in terms of like highlighting what's going wrong, because a lot of these kids who are depressed or anxious, they're not really doing it intentionally. They're looking for help and looking for ways to restart or re-engage the life that they wanted. And so there I would probably send a more encouraging message and saying, look, I'm noticing that you're not enjoying the things that you used to enjoy. So what kinds of things can we do to help encourage that? Because it's going to take some effort on your part too. So if it's simply that the kids are simply depressed or anxious, I wouldn't look to take things away from them first. Rather, I would look to add on some incentives for them to actually be motivated to do things that would ultimately help them out.
Well, thank you. We have gone way late, so at that, I am going to wrap this up tonight. Dr. Chu, thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thank you all for joining us on our webinar on Getting Unstuck. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board is open now and open for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. The website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our presentation on body-focused repetitive behaviors, helping teens and young adults manage stress and anxiety, presented by Dr. Rachel Stroll, is scheduled for March 12, 2014. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Chu, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending.